All right, welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man.
And joining us today is Bronwen Mehta. Bronwen is a TMBS alumnus, and also she's a politics PhD candidate at the University of Warwick. Bronwen, what else? How else would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm a gender researcher, currently doing my PhD. I'm also on the Committee for Academic Freedom for the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies. So a lot of this is kind of related to that job.
Interesting. Okay, so let's start. We want to talk about COP27, the 27th. COP climate. What does COP stand for? I didn't even think about to look.
It actually stands for Conference of the Parties. COP is used kind of generically for any large kind of international thing, but it seems to be associated exclusively with the climate change movement at the moment. It's linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So every year this framework hosts COP. So this is the 27th year of that conference.
And I don't want to be too cynical. I mean, David and I were talking about it. It seems like it comes around, and there were some interesting splits last year, I thought, between developing countries or companies who need, frankly, reparation from climate harms and things like that versus more, America being like, oh, well, let's just pull up our bootstraps and innovate our way out of this. But is it too unfair, Bronwen, to call it like the Olympics of not doing anything about climate change? Like, there's some interesting people there on an individual level, but it's very corporatized and, kind of.
Well, they're also sponsored by Coca-Cola. They have panels sponsored by Coca-Cola this year. So it does have that Olympics feel to it.
Absolutely. And Egypt have hired a PR company that have also worked with Coca-Cola and Shell and for COP27. So I think it's right to be cynical. I mean, COP's kind of aim is to hold countries to account for agreements that they've made. So now it's based on the Paris Accord. So every year countries are supposed to declare how much carbon of their greenhouse gas emissions. So it's supposed to kind of be a system of accountability. But as you rightfully say, that hasn't necessarily been the case. Each year has kind of taken a different focus. And I think the case that Sisi made for why it should be held in Egypt and why Africa specifically it's really important to be hosting COP there was because they want to focus on this idea of climate finance and, as you said, reparations. So that, I think, is going to be one of the key areas of negotiation in this COP, which wasn't necessarily in COP26. That was kind of more focused on, like methane gas reduction, other things like that. But one of the explicit goals of COP27 is coming to kind of tighter agreements on financing. But we'll see to what extent that occurs, because theoretically, the climate fund of $100 billion from the global north to the global south already is supposed to be in place. But they've been missing the targets every single year. So I think the global south governments are going to try and use COP27 as an opportunity to push countries in the global north to actually stick to these agreements that they've already made but are falling short on. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, COP26 didn't necessarily achieve that much. Obviously, you have people like Greta Thunberg coming out and, with her famous blah, blah, blah speech. So I think it's definitely sensible to be critical of these processes, but currently they're kind of the only forms of accountability on an international level that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, was it La Ruta del Clima, or I always get that wrong, Clima, with a Sam, and I forget who Sam works with, Sam Goodman. But yeah, it is like, at least you can kind of start to get a momentum. Like Ben Shapiro is concerned about countries asking for climate reparations, which I think is a little bit of like maybe that anxiety bubbling up from countries, putting their case forcefully. let's talk about Egypt. That is interesting. I never thought of that. The significance of setting it in Egypt on the continent of Africa. Can you talk a little bit about Egypt's ecological record and the setting there?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because it does seem Sisi's regime does have a very kind of seemingly contradictory relationship with kind of climate policy, because on the one hand, Egypt is scaling up its gas and oil production, and a lot of this is fueled by the consumption needs in Europe, especially now that the EU is trying to move away from dependence on Russia. So there's this huge new gas deal that they're trying to make at the moment with Egypt and Israel. And Israeli gas basically goes through Egypt, is liquefied, and then passed on to Europe for consumption. So that all of that kind of process is being scaled up. But at the same time, you also have huge investments in solar energy because obviously there's a lot of desert and a lot of sunshine in Egypt. But a lot of those kind of construction projects the military is very heavily involved in those. So that seems to be where a lot of the investment is coming from and where the profits are going to go. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but then, and you also have a lot of renewable energy companies in Egypt who are starting to, or trying to participate in the carbon offsetting industry, which is obviously a hugely growing industry. And there's a lot of questions from climate activists as to the efficacy of carbon offsetting, because it doesn't necessarily reduce the overall emissions. And also there's this huge issue, which seems so obvious, of double counting. So Egypt are going to include the carbon offsetting and the renewable energy as a reduction in terms of what they're declaring. But the companies that are based in the global north that are purchasing these carbon offsetting contracts are also going to be declaring these as a reduction in their emissions. So that's kind of, that's got a lot of criticism from climate activists. You also have across Cairo, Sisi's regime have destroyed over like 1 million acres of green space within the city, which didn't have that much green space to begin with. Old trees are being torn down in order to build like a commercial strip within the Nile, which is just a huge concrete structure. And obviously, trees in urban settings play a huge role in reducing pollution and also reducing temperatures for, people experiencing them on a street level. So it seems as though the regime is willing to kind of participate in performative projects like recycling and, things that you can put a happy face on, photo opportunities with children cleaning up beaches. But anything that kind of fundamentally requires altering the country's economy, their dependence on concrete. The military are huge players in the construction industry in Egypt, and they kind of depend on these kind of high like energy consuming projects that like they might have solar panels on at the end, but the actual kind of production system is hugely damaging to the environment. But those kind of things are you're unable to kind of speak about those or criticize them. So actual data on these things is very, very hard to come by.
Mm. So on that, like, because this is one of the things, even in the US where I'd be curious, like, how strong and where are they coming from demands to sort of decarbonize and to sort of green the economy in Egypt within Egypt? Because that's one of the tensions here is that, like, Biden keeps on putting up this term frontline communities, which is like poor communities are going to be hit worse with climate change. But when you go and interview people who live in those quote unquote frontline communities, they might believe in climate change. They think it's real, but they don't think that it's like going to hit them. So it's not like their number one issue. I was just curious if you had any insight into the dynamic in Egypt as well.
Well, I mean, generally kind of any public organizing on a political level is very difficult to do. As I said, there are some kind of more performative things like beach clear ups that are easier to organize. So I think it's very hard to establish exactly how much desire there is for these kind of more progressive climate policies because political opposition is so sidelined. But at the same time, there are definitely examples of communities coming together. Like there was an example, I think in 2013, of a town called Idku, which there was a BP and RWE, which is a German company, pipeline that was supposed to be going through there, and it was damaging the local ecosystem, and the community kind of rose up, protested, and managed to kind of disrupt that pipeline process. But then after that, after the success of that, that meant that the regime came down more harshly on other people trying to protest. But there are definitely a lot of activists. I mean, you know, the prisons are full of them, unfortunately. There's like 600,000 is the number that we use a lot, but we really have no idea how many people are in prison for political reasons. And some of those are for climate-related research. And so many NGOs and local organizations have been forced to abandon research into climate policies because of these restrictions. So it does seem like there are people trying to push for that. And that is one of the key demands that civil society actors are calling for in COP27, is engagement with these communities and with these NGOs. But unfortunately, it's hard to know what the demands even are, because they've not been given effective voices.
Well, on that, before we get, because I just think some of our audience might be in different places. I mean, I know there's a lot in here, but could you give folks just a general understanding of what has happened in Egypt over the past like 10 years politically? Because I think a lot of Americans, obviously, they know about the uprising and stuff, but I hear people cite it to me with that, and, you know, then we'll ask them, it's like, well, what about Egypt today? And they have no idea, you know, that there's now, you know, military rule in the country again. But if you could break that down for our audience, so we're all just operating from the same level.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, so very brief summary of the last 10 years. Obviously, there was the revolution in 2011, which was followed by a democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood leadership, but the military still kind of operated in the background, because, you know, they controlled a lot of like economic output and kind of the infrastructures. So having a parliament and a presidency in control by the Muslim Brotherhood didn't necessarily mean that the military had kind of lost their control over the major infrastructures. Then Sisi kind of came into power after a military coup in 2013, and kind of solidified his regime over the following years incredibly violently. So there were the Rabaa massacre, there was a massacre in Maspero, like there was some really like horribly violent like attacks by the military regime. And then since then, we've seen Sisi kind of repeatedly making claims of a emergency in terms of national security. So there were threats from ISIS and Sinai, but he's used these like national security threats to continue to extend emergency laws. So Egypt is still technically in a state of emergency, and that means that, for example, certain courts, you don't have appeal systems if you're tried by this specific emergency set of courts. And in that time, Egypt's really had some significant economic hardship, partially due to the agreements that they've made with the IMF. The Egyptian pound has plummeted in value. It halved overnight in 2016 in November. And then again, maybe a couple of weeks ago, another deal with the IMF was agreed upon, a $3 billion loan. And in order to gain that, the central bank had to stop propping up the Egyptian currency, which again has meant that the Egyptian pound has plummeted in value once again. So we've got like real poverty on the rise. The healthcare system was really put to the test during COVID. But Sisi's really relying on being seen as a figure of strength and being able to kind of secure the country nationally. But those claims are kind of wavering because it's been so long since the revolution, and now people's kind of economic daily needs are more important than this kind of ghost, this myth of a national security threat. But unfortunately, they had a referendum in 2019, which was, I mean, the system was a complete sham, but it basically ensured that Sisi could maintain power until 2030, as opposed to 2022, when his previous term of office should have ended. So we may, I mean, who knows how long he'll be around for, but he's definitely kind of secure now constitutionally in his position, at least for the next few years.
Matt, yeah, you cut yourself.
You mentioned he's sort of performing a dialogue in advance of COP27. What's this dialogue consist of?
Yeah, so in April this year, he announced a national dialogue. And it's basically, I mean, he's kind of presented it as a process to involve opposition thinkers from all different backgrounds, to come and create a kind of stronger economic, political, modern Egypt. That's the aim of this project. So he did start by creating a board of trustees, which was surprisingly diverse. There were some like strong Sisi supporters within that, but there were also some people from the opposition. There was some people from like the Syndicate of Journalists, the National Council of Women. And then this group of people are basically supposed to open a conversation, invite various people from various stakeholders from all across society to come up with ways to modernize Egypt and improve it, make it a kind of, more productive society. So that's kind of what was pitched. But then over time, it seems like very little has materialized from that. According to the most recent reports, they've got through the planning stages and it's still, in the process of it's going to happen soon, but it has already narrowed its scope. So at the beginning, it was supposed to be all-inclusive. Anyone was supposed to be allowed to be involved in this process. But very shortly after, there was speculation as to whether that everyone includes the Muslim Brotherhood. But so that's been shut out. The Muslim Brotherhood are not going to be allowed in that. So now kind of opposition are starting to be a bit more skeptical as to what it's actually capable of achieving. We've had some with the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies. We have been sending letters on behalf of certain political prisoners, trying to kind of lobby for their release and make that one of the demands. And it does seem like that some of the people on the Board of Trustees are open to these kind of demands. However, it seems unlikely that they will actually have the power to implement any of this. I think the most convincing take I've heard is that this is all kind of part of Sisi's rebranding to try and make the country kind of more appealing to European and American investments, especially with all the kind of new energy deals that are occurring at the moment. And with COP27 on the horizon, this was a good way to seem like they were taking steps forward, because whilst the National Dialogue is making claims of defending the 2014 Constitution, which protects everyone's human rights and is rosy and brilliant, within those months, people have been rounded up for social media posts. The number of political prisoners is on the rise. There have been a few strategic releases, but more people have been arrested than have been released. So, it doesn't seem like the regime is appearing to be willing to make the kind of changes that the National Dialogue is claiming it should be.
And I mean, let's zoom in on one of those political prisoners. You introduced Allah Abdel Fattah to me. Who is Allah Abdel Fattah, and how has he been in and out of prison?
Yeah, so he's probably one of maybe the most prominent activist from the 2011 revolution. He was one of the key figures that was communicating what was going on in the streets to the international audience. So he was very creative with his use of social media, and that kind of took the whole world on the journey with him. But he was present at nearly every protest. He witnessed friends dying. He went through the traumas of it. And he has had a long history beforehand. He was arrested in 2006, but for demanding an independent judiciary. So this is really, his whole life has been advocating for democracy. And his kind of vision for what the revolution should have been is inclusive, diverse, the kind of democracy that we were all kind of hoping that Egypt would find after the revolution. But obviously that made him a very dangerous figure in Sisi's eyes, because he still was putting forward this these kind of compelling demands for justice. He wasn't, it wasn't dreaming too big. He was saying, this is what's in the Constitution. We're demanding the rights that we're entitled to. And he was a very effective communicator, fighting on the grounds that, he would go through the judicial systems that were in place, because he said, okay, I'm going to give them legitimacy, but then you actually have to operate in the way that you claim to. So yeah, he was in and out of prison because of his activism. And, the charges were all these kind of spurious claims of inciting violence and all of these things. But then in 2019, in September 2019, there was a wave of protests that, he wasn't even related to, but he was rearrested. And then in 2021, I think he was charged with spreading false news because he reshared a Facebook post. So he's been sentenced to 5 years without appeal. And that's on top of, the years in prison that he'd done in the kind of interim period. So since May, he's been on hunger strike, and he's just reduced that now. When COP begins, he's going to only be consuming water, and he's already, he's already been doing over 200 days on reduced calories. So he's already wasting away. But if he's also a British citizen, so whilst he's been in prison, he received his British citizenship. So theoretically, he is the responsibility of the British government. So we've been campaigning along with his sisters, who have been doing a sit-in outside the British Parliament to basically force the British government to, do something about this and ensure that he has his access to the British Council, which he is constitutionally mandated to, because realistically, before COP finishes, he'll either have been released or he'll be dead, because he's been through this process of imprisonment so many times. He just can't do it anymore. So he's taking a stand, and he's taking a stand for all the other political prisoners as well. Like, he's very clear that he's demanding the rights that he and all the other prisoners are entitled to. But yeah, it's really powerful, but it's very timely. We're all checking Twitter constantly to see if there's been any update, because yeah, it's really like down to the wire at this point.
Is there anything more to say on the UK angle? I mean, there's so much going on with British politics. Is there any traction being won with all that going on?
Yeah, unfortunately, I was speaking to his sister Mona about this, and it really has been terrible timing, because it did seem like there was some progress when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, not to, give him much credit, but just because, they had a specific person that they were targeting, but because things have been changing so rapidly. But they did just get today from James Cleverly, I think his name is, who is the Home Secretary. He's said that they're working on it, that him and Rishi Sunak, who is now the Prime Minister, are working on securing Allah's release. So all we can do is kind of hope that that's the case. But it's important to acknowledge that the only reason that I think they're feeling pressured into this is because there's been a huge kind of global outpouring of support for Allah from people like Greta, but from also the US Democrats. I think 56 US lawmakers in the past couple of days have signed a letter to Joe Biden, pressuring him to use his power to on the issue of political prisoners. So I think the British government are thankfully feeling pressure from all sides, because it would look very bad for them if he dies in prison, which is what's going to happen unless they secure his release.
Yeah. Well, you've sort of touched on it a little bit, but there's, another really, I don't know, it's a window, I think, for people into what's been going on in Egypt regarding NGOs and being able to attend the conference. I mean, could you talk about that for a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So just to kind of say, there was a 2019 law in Egypt where any NGOs or research groups, if they were publishing any research that's political, they had to get government permission in order to do so. So obviously that's hugely limited what NGOs are capable of doing in the first place. But then with COP27 specifically, they've kind of doubled down on that. The registration system has basically blocked any groups that are skeptical of the regime from registering. So there's this huge list of human rights organizations that have not been given permission to attend. And unlike in other COPs, where there's a kind of open protest space that's designated, the protest space that has been kind of carved out in Sharm el-Sheikh is far away from all the action. You also have to register, put down your name, put down all your details. You can only protest between a certain time frame, between 10 and 5. There is huge amounts of surveillance on you at all times. So for Egyptian NGOs and researchers and climate activists, that's a hugely dangerous thing for them to be to agree to do. It's not a space for actual genuine protests to happen. So all of the NGOs that are going to be present, the Egyptian NGOs that are going to be present, are going to be groups that are regime approved. And the UN FCCC, who are kind of the parent of COP, have responded really terribly on this and have basically said, that it's up to the host country to determine the processes for allowing groups to register. So it's just not really ensuring that this open civil society space is created at all. So a group of NGOs have come together and created a group called COP Civic Space, and they're kind of pushing, lobbying to use this international attention to help try and call for a kind of more open dialogue, because it's so important for events like this to happen in the global south, because they are disproportionately affected, but it needs to be genuine conversation with authentic local actors that have not been curated just to ensure that Egypt gives the best impression to an international audience, which is just not going to be the case. Oh, one thing that I just want to add, it's not just the NGOs, it's also Egyptian workers themselves. They've been receiving letters and information telling them that when they're not working, they have to remain in their residences. So when the international people are coming and, enjoying Sharm el-Sheikh, having a nice camel ride on a beach, whatever, enjoying the eco buses with solar panels, great. The actual workers that have set all that up for them are being kept out of sight, out of mind, in their residences. They're not allowed out. And it just shows that the entire space is going to be curated for the kind of global north Western gaze.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly irresponsible of the UN, because, as you're saying, the climate finance fight is absolutely critical, but this also allows Sisi to be able to present themselves as a leader of like the global south in this fight, while allowing them to very clearly launder their image to all of these I don't know, climate activists, the right word, climate representatives might feel a little bit better, but yeah.
I wanted to ask, kind of related to the what we all know of the Egypt revolution, and basically it's, if you read about it in The Economist, it's look at what phones did. Yeah. And I'm curious about your reflections on that, because I think as you say with Abdel Fattah, communications was important to that, but I'm just curious how you emphasize and stress the lessons of that.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a very popular narrative, and it really kind of took off in the Western media in the years that came. It was named the Facebook revolution, the Twitter revolution, all of these things. And I think whilst it's true that these forms of communication did play a role, it's disingenuous to suggest that they were kind of one of the key factors, because these protest movements have their roots in the labor organizing that had been happening for the previous decade, and the protests and the strikes that had come out of that. Back in 2011, maybe only around 25% of the Egyptian population had access to the internet on a regular basis in order to kind of get onto Facebook and Twitter. So even now, I think it's only around 50% of the Egyptian population do, and it's rising rapidly, but it just goes to show that a lot of the population, that's not how they're accessing that information. So there were other kind of fundamental things, but yeah, Twitter and Facebook were important for having that international audience, which does help, it does play a role, but the kind of on the ground organizing, that wasn't just a product of Twitter and Facebook. It was word of mouth. Things were being spread. People were protesting all across the country, and it wasn't just a product of Twitter.
I mean, it's like you're completely ignoring like the human factor there. It'd be like calling the American Revolution like the pamphlet revolution, right?
Pamphlet revolution, yeah.
It's like, don't worry. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, communication is very important and all of that, but it's like there's people and human structures that are creating these moments.
And I think also, there were local blocks on the internet at certain times. So, at some point, that wasn't even the way that people were able to communicate. So, it's just, obviously, it's a lot more complex and nuanced than that, even if it's a nice kind of way to package it to the Western audience, who can pat themselves on the back because, these products are built in Silicon Valley. Yeah. So, we've saved Egypt. That's can kind of be the way that the West tries to perceive it.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly better marketing for Facebook than like the sort of genocide, party to genocide stuff that they're getting documented for now. But Bronwen Mehta, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. Where can people follow your work?
So definitely go to the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies to look at all our advocacy campaigns. You can also find me on Twitter at Bronwen Mehta. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things going on in terms of COP27, so many campaigns going on. So please try and get involved, especially with the case with Ale. It's very time critical. So if you can write to your representative, that would be amazing.
Yeah, the writing to the representative on issues like this is where you can move a needle. And even like you, like I don't know the Tories as well, but like occasional Republican will like have a staff that will send a letter. So it's like, it's worthwhile to just, buzz their ear about these sorts of things. As opposed to like, nationalizing industries, that's a little bit tougher, but it's
like
worth the time.
Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut has been a real leader on this. He interviewed Ale's sisters. So there are definitely very sympathetic people in the US that you might be able to help kind of, escalate this issue.
All right. Thanks so much, Bronwen.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.